Phil Mickelson built one of the most recognizable names in golf, but his own son, Evan, may now be facing a very different relationship with that name. For years, the Mickelson surname has carried a meaning in golf that few family names can match. It belongs to Phil Mickelson, a six-time major champion whose career transformed him from a talented left-handed golfer into one of the most recognizable figures in the sport. The reason is not a tournament victory, a dramatic interview, or a public family dispute. It is something far smaller and potentially far more revealing, but a surprising change in how Evan's name appears on collegiate golf materials has now raised an obvious question. Why would the son of Phil Mickelson alter the way he is publicly identified? On its own, a roster entry might seem like an insignificant administrative detail. College athletic departments update names, records, and player information for many ordinary reasons. But when the athlete involved carries one of golf's most recognizable surnames, even a subtle change can attract attention. Is Evan trying to establish an identity separate from his father? Is he attempting to make his collegiate career about his own performance rather than Phil Mickelson's achievements? Or could this simply be a routine roster adjustment that has attracted attention because of the famous surname attached to it? What do you think? Share your opinion in the comments, and while you're there, tell us your age. We'd love to know how old you are. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe for more golf stories and updates. For Evan Mickelson, growing up meant living with a surname that was already famous before he had the chance to create an identity of his own. His father was not simply a professional golfer. Phil Mickelson was one of the biggest personalities in the sport, a six-time major champion whose every tournament appearance attracted cameras, headlines, and enormous public attention. That environment can create opportunities most young athletes could only imagine. Evan had access to elite golf environments, professional-level competition, and a first-hand view of what it takes to compete at the highest level. But those advantages came with another reality. People would always know him first as Phil Mickelson's son. For an ordinary collegiate golfer, a tournament result is primarily about personal performance. For Evan, the same result could invite an entirely different conversation. A good round could be viewed as evidence that he inherited his father's talent. A difficult round could become a comparison to one of the greatest players of his generation. That distinction matters. Instead of simply asking how Evan was developing as a golfer, outsiders could easily ask whether he was following in Phil's footsteps. Every appearance on a leaderboard carried the possibility of another comparison, and that is the unusual pressure behind the roster story. Because when your father's name is already larger than the sport itself, creating your own identity requires more than simply playing well. It requires finding a way to make people see the athlete first, and the famous surname second. For Evan, that challenge followed him into collegiate golf. The real challenge of carrying the Mickelson name is not simply the attention that comes with it. It is the expectation attached to every performance. For Evan, the standard was established before he ever had the opportunity to establish one for himself. In collegiate golf, every player is ultimately judged by results. Scores, tournament finishes, consistency, and contribution to the team determine how an athlete is evaluated. But when the athlete is Phil Mickelson's son, those results can become part of a much larger narrative. A strong performance can immediately invite comparisons with his father. A difficult tournament can create questions about whether Evan is capable of reaching the standard associated with the Mickelson name. Either way, his identity as a golfer risks becoming secondary to his identity as Phil Mickelson's son. That creates a difficult psychological balance. The famous surname provides obvious advantages. It creates recognition, attracts attention, and connects Evan to a family history that already has an established place in golf. But the same recognition can make it harder to separate personal achievement from inherited reputation. The pressure becomes especially significant when a young athlete is trying to establish a future of his own. Evan does not need to duplicate Phil's 6 major championships to prove that he belongs in competitive golf. His challenge is different. He needs the freedom to develop his own game, make his own mistakes, and eventually be judged by what he accomplishes rather than what his father accomplished decades before him. That is why the reported roster change becomes more interesting than a simple name adjustment. If Evan is deliberately presenting himself differently, it could represent something larger than paperwork. It could be a quiet attempt to create distance between the golfer people see on the course and the legendary father they already know. The question is whether that distinction was intentional. And until Evan explains it himself, that question remains at the center of the story. For much of Phil Mickelson's career, the family name represented one of the safest and most valuable brands in professional golf. Phil was not simply successful, he was recognizable, charismatic, and closely connected with generations of golf fans. The Mickelson name carried the weight of championships, endorsements, television appearances, and decades of public familiarity. For Evan, however, growing up inside that brand meant inheriting both its advantages and its complications. The perception surrounding Phil changed significantly as his career entered a more controversial period. His gambling history attracted intense attention. His involvement with LIV Golf placed him at the center of one of the biggest divisions professional golf had experienced in decades. His public comments and disputes created additional scrutiny around a name that had once been almost universally associated with the popular side of the sport. That matters because a family surname does not exist in isolation. When a famous athlete's public reputation changes, the people carrying that same name can become part of the conversation whether they want to be or not. For Evan, that creates a complicated situation. He is attempting to establish himself as a collegiate golfer at the same time that his father's name continues to generate headlines far beyond the golf course. The issue is not necessarily whether Evan agrees or disagrees with Phil. There is no evidence in the available material that Evan has publicly rejected his father or explained his personal feelings about Phil's controversies. The more relevant issue is the unavoidable association. A tournament roster may contain only a player's name, but spectators and journalists can attach an entire history to that name. That is why even a seemingly minor change in Evan's roster presentation can attract attention. If the adjustment was simply administrative, the story ends there. But if Evan intentionally wants his collegiate career presented differently, then the change takes on a much deeper meaning. It could signal a young athlete attempting to control the one thing his famous father cannot control for him: how the world knows him. And that brings the story directly to the roster shift itself. After spending years being identified through his connection to Phil Mickelson, Evan's name appeared differently on collegiate team materials, creating an unexpected question around how he wanted to be presented as an athlete. What do you think? Was Evan's name change simply administrative, or could it be a step toward building his own identity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're enjoying the story, make sure to subscribe for more golf stories and updates. But Evan's situation is different because of the surname attached to it. Mickelson is not an ordinary name in golf. It immediately connects any player carrying it to Phil's championships, fame, controversies, and enormous public profile. A change in how that name appears, therefore, attracts more attention than the same adjustment would receive for an unknown collegiate golfer. That is where the central mystery begins. Was Evan simply listed under an alternative version of his name for administrative reasons, or did the change reflect a desire to control how his identity is presented while he develops his own collegiate career? The available material does not establish that Evan publicly announced an intention to reject his father's surname. There is also no confirmed statement from Evan explaining the reason for the roster change. That distinction is important. What can be examined is the timing and the symbolism. A young golfer whose identity has always been connected to one of the biggest names in golf suddenly appears differently on an official collegiate roster. Whether accidental, administrative, or intentional, the result is the same. It draws attention to the question of where Evan's identity ends and Phil's legacy begins. And if the change was deliberate, it could represent something much bigger than a roster update. It could be Evan's quiet first step toward making sure that when people look at the leaderboard, they see his name, his score, and his career, not simply his father's shadow. What makes the roster change particularly intriguing is not only the possibility of a different name presentation, but the apparent lack of public explanation surrounding it. There has been no dramatic announcement from Evan declaring that he wants to separate himself from his father's identity. There has been no public family confrontation attached to the change, and that silence matters. In today's sports environment, athletes can explain even the smallest personal decision instantly through social media. A name change can become a statement, a post can become a headline, and a private disagreement can become public within hours. Evan's situation, by contrast, raises questions precisely because there is no confirmed explanation attached to the roster shift. That leaves room for multiple interpretations. Perhaps the change is purely administrative. Perhaps it reflects a preferred form of his name. Or perhaps Evan simply wants greater control over how he is identified while competing at the collegiate level. What cannot be established from the roster alone is that the move represents a rejection of Phil. That distinction is important. A young athlete can want independence without wanting to sever a family relationship. Wanting to be recognized individually does not automatically mean rejecting the person whose name made that identity famous in the first place. If Evan did intentionally make the adjustment, its quiet nature could actually make it more meaningful. Rather than turning the decision into a public controversy, he may simply be allowing his performance to speak for itself, and that would fit the larger story perfectly. Because the most powerful way to step out of someone's shadow is not always to fight against it. Sometimes it is simply to stand somewhere else and let people learn your name on your own terms. At the center of Evan's story is a simple ambition that every serious athlete eventually faces: the desire to be judged by what they can accomplish themselves. For Evan, that challenge carries an unusual complication. His father has already established a legendary standard in professional golf, meaning Evan cannot enter the sport as an unknown player. Before he hits a shot, people already know the surname on his scorecard. Before he records a result, comparisons can begin. That makes personal autonomy especially important. If Evan wants to build a collegiate career on his own terms, his focus has to remain on the things he can actually control: preparation, performance, consistency, and development. He cannot change his father's career, the public perception surrounding Phil, or the expectations attached to the Mickelson name. What he can control is how he competes, and potentially how he chooses to present himself. That is why the roster shift becomes such an interesting part of the larger story. If the change was intentional, it could be viewed as a small but meaningful step towards separating Evan's athletic identity from his father's reputation. The goal would not necessarily be to erase Phil from his life. It would be to make sure Phil does not become the only explanation for Evan's career. Ultimately, a collegiate golfer earns recognition one round at a time. Scores cannot be inherited, tournament results cannot be borrowed, and no famous surname can hit the ball for another player. If Evan succeeds, the most important name on the leaderboard may eventually be his own. There is an unavoidable irony in what Evan's reported roster shift could represent. Phil Mickelson spent decades building a name powerful enough to become synonymous with elite golf. His championships, personality, and longevity turned the Mickelson surname into a global sporting brand. That legacy gave his family extraordinary advantages. Evan grew up with access to an environment most young golfers could never experience, surrounded by professional golf and the knowledge that his father had already reached the highest levels of the sport. But the same legacy can create an unexpected problem. When one family member becomes larger than the sport itself, the next generation can struggle to establish an identity that is not immediately connected to that success. Every achievement risks becoming a comparison. Every setback can be measured against a standard that was never realistically theirs to begin with. That is where the potential meaning of Evan's name presentation becomes so compelling. If he is intentionally emphasizing his own identity, then Phil's greatest legacy may ironically become something Evan needs to step outside of before he can fully establish his own. Ultimately, the significance of Evan Mickelson's reported collegiate roster shift comes down to one unanswered question. Was it simply an administrative change, or was it a deliberate step toward establishing an identity separate from his father? What do you think? Should Evan keep the Mickelson name or build his own identity? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more golf stories and updates.